What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and I'm pretty excited about today's video because it is finally time for my week one fantasy football content. I know people are excited to go out, actually set their fantasy football lineups. So in today's video, I'm going to be diving into my week one running back start sit video. If you guys are new to the channel, you weren't here last season, the way I structure my start sit videos is I actually go through and talk about every single matchup. So I'll be talking about all 16 games, all 32 teams, talking about every single fantasy relevant running back, and I'm going to be listing them as either a start, a fringe option, or a sit. So the starts are going to be the running backs that I think are solid plays, the guys you trust as your running back one or running back two in your fantasy football lineups. The fringe options, these are more of your RB3s, maybe they're flex options. You probably don't love playing them, but they're fine. And then sits, pretty self-explanatory, guys that you would prefer to keep on your bench. So early in the week, I go through my start sits, and then a few days later, during the actual season, I'll put out my rankings videos so you can kind of see how I have these running backs stacked together in terms of my weekly rankings. But if you guys enjoyed the video, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel. Then I also have timestamps down below if you guys want to jump around to specific matchups. But let's dive right into the Thursday night game. A great matchup here. We have the Baltimore Ravens taking on the Kansas City Chiefs. And I don't think this one is all that controversial. Derrick Henry's a start. Isaiah Pacheco's a start. These are two running backs that should probably be viewed as like back-end RB1s this week. For Derrick Henry, I might be a little bit low on him in terms of redraft, but he's definitely someone that's obviously locked into your fantasy lineup. And then for Isaiah Pacheco, I think he also took a little bit of a hit with the signing of Samaje Perine, but still someone who should be reliable as a fantasy running back one option. Now, I believe this next matchup is actually taking place on Friday. We have the Packers taking on the Eagles, and this one is also pretty simple. If you drafted Josh Jacobs, likely around 2, 3, 4 pick, he's definitely a start in your fantasy football lineups. Very thin running back room right now for the Packers. I like Marshawn Lloyd as like a later, breakout candidate later on in the season, but at this point, definitely not someone who I'm looking to play. And then for the Eagles, they went out, they got Saquon Barkley. You probably picked him late round one, somewhere in round two. He is also obviously going to be a start. Then looking at the Sunday matchups, we have the Steelers taking on the Falcons. And for the Steelers backfield, I have both Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren listed as fringe options. I am expecting this to be a very close committee. Jaylen Warren suffered an injury in the preseason, but it definitely seems like he is trending towards playing here in week one. The Falcons were a tough matchup last year for opposing running backs. They allowed the 8th fewest points per game to the running back position last year. So I think both Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren should be viewed as RB3s. I think there are going to be certain matchups later on in the year, maybe where there are bye weeks or, plus matchups where both these guys could be listed as starts. But week one, don't have an overwhelming amount of confidence in this offense. Not the best matchup. I think they're both like RB3 plays. And then on the other side for the Falcons, Bijan Robinson is a pretty clear start for me. He's a consensus top 3 running back. Arthur Smith is gone. I think Bijan Robinson is going to absolutely smash this year. I know there are some people who are kind of optimistic about Tyler Allgeier's usage. I'm not really one of those people. I think he's more of a handcuff. Could he be involved? Sure. Is he going to have some games where maybe he logs like 10 carries, gets into the end zone? Potentially. But I just don't think he's someone you should be considering playing, especially here in week one. Like if Tyler Allgeier is a starting running back for you, you're probably in some trouble if you're in a normal sized league. So that's going to be the first Sunday matchup. Then we have the Cardinals taking on the Bills. And for the Cardinals, James Conner is someone who I've really kind of come around on as like a redraft pick. Earlier on in the offseason, I thought Trey Benson could kind of force a committee potentially early on in the season. But I feel pretty good about James Conner, especially for like the first half of the 2024 season. He was really good last year. Trey Benson hasn't made like a massive impact throughout training camp into the preseason. So I think James Conner is a nice start as a running back 2 option. And I think James Cook is also a nice start here. Someone who's like a fringe running back 1 play, not going to get super involved on the goal line, but will have decent rushing volume, will be very involved as a pass catcher for Josh Allen. So I think both the starters here are pretty clear starts. Then we're going to have the Titans taking on the Bears. And for the Titans here, I'm expecting a very, very close committee between Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears. That's what we saw in the preseason. Week one, where they played the starters, Tony Pollard played 8 snaps, Spears played 6. Pollard saw 4 carries, 2 targets. Spears saw 3 carries, 1 target. in week 3. They each just took an entire drive with the starters. So Pollard took the first drive, Spears took the second. I think they're both RB3s this week. I wouldn't say this is a great or terrible matchup here going up against the Bears, but I think early on it's going to be 50-50. We still have some uncertainty with this Titans offense, so I think they're both RB3s. We'll see if one guy can kind of separate, or maybe in a plus matchup, you can play both of these dudes, but right now, RB3 options. Then for the Bears, I will say I kind of switched DeAndre Swift last minute as a start. I originally had him as a fringe option, and I do think it's a little bit unclear how this Bears running back room is going to be rolled out. Like, is Khalil Herbert the goal line back? How much third down usage is Roschon Johnson taking? But you look at DeAndre Swift, he got paid this offseason. Week 1, I think he's going to come in. He's going to have that solid usage. Typically, it is a good idea to follow the money at the running back position. You even think about a guy last year like Miles Sanders, where he got paid, and even though, by the end of the year, he didn't play well enough, he lost his starting job, he was still someone who had solid usage early on in the season. So I think Swift's going to get that usage. The Bears have the 8th highest implied point total, so Vegas thinks they're going to put up some solid points here. I think he's a nice back-end RB2 play this week. So I do have him as a start. Khalil Herbert, Roschon Johnson, both going to be sits for me. Now looking at the Patriots Bengals matchup here, for the Patriots, I like Ramondre as an RB2 play. I'd say mid to back end RB2 option. I don't think this Patriots offense is going to be very good, but I think he has receiving upside. He should have an overall solid workload. So I like Ramondre as a start. Sitting Antonio Gibson, he's going to have some involvement, but I view him more as a handcuff play. Plus, just on a tough offense, tough to trust like the second option. And then for the Bengals here, we've had a few running back rooms already that I think are very close to 50-50 splits. This Bengals backfield is another one that's pretty ambiguous at this point. They signed Zach Moss in the offseason. He didn't play in the preseason, which is probably a good sign that, they're going to have him very involved with the starters. Chase Brown played week 1 of the preseason, and he played 100% of the snaps with the starters. So Zach Moss wasn't in there. Chase Brown, clearly is the top guy that they had active that week. So in terms of their split, I'd imagine Zach Moss is getting more of like the goal line work, the short yardage stuff. And then I'd assume Chase Brown is the guy who's getting more work as a pass catcher. So I think they could each pay off. I think in certain matchups, they could both be RB2s. But right now, this is another spot where I'd rather just have them as RB3s, kind of get a look at what this committee looks like, before we make a strong stand here. In the next one, we are going to have the Texans taking on the Colts. And for the Texans here, I feel like Joe Mixon is going to handle a really solid workload. You have Dameon Pierce, Cam Akers as like depth running backs. I think Mixon's a strong start, like fringe RB1 play. Then for the Colts, another kind of no-brainer here. If you drafted Jonathan Taylor, you are obviously playing him in your fantasy football lineups. Then we have the Jaguars taking on the Dolphins. For the Jaguars, Travis Etienne, round 2 fantasy pick, handled a really solid opportunity share last year. I think he's a nice pick. I think Tank Bigsby is a nice handcuff option, but certainly not someone you want to play here in week 1. And then for the Dolphins, if you guys have seen my channel, I am very, very high on Devon Achane. But just because I'm very high on Achane does not mean that I'm out on Raheem Mostert at all. I think both these guys are really solid starts. Both of them were top 5 in PPR points per game last season. The Dolphins are really one of maybe the only team that can support like 2 high upside running backs. We literally saw them do it last year. So I like Achane as a start. I also like Raheem Mostert. I really like Jalen Wright as like a late round draft pick, potential handcuff for both of these guys. I think he could find his way into this backfield at some point, but early on in the season, I think it's going to be Achane and Mostert unless one of those guys goes down with injury. So Achane and Mostert, I think, are both solid starts this week for fantasy. Then with a divisional matchup, we have the Panthers taking on the Saints. And right now for the Panthers, I have Chuba Hubbard listed as a fringe option and then Miles Sanders as a sit. We found out a few days ago that Jonathan Brooks is going to be starting off the year on the PUP, and I would expect Chuba Hubbard to lead this backfield to start the season. I talked earlier about how Miles Sanders got paid last offseason, started as the starter, got beat out by Chuba Hubbard. Chuba is the number 1 running back on the depth chart right now, and I do think there is some upside in the short term for Chuba here because Dave Canales, coming over from the Bucs, he used Rachaad White like a workhorse last year, but it's a very different situation. Maybe he doesn't feel as strongly about Chuba as like the last coaching staff did. It's tough to feel 100% confident in terms of what his usage is going to look like. So I'd rather just wait a week. If you have to play him as like your RB3, maybe you have a hero RB, zero RB build, and he's in there. I think that's fine, but I would view him as more of a running back 3 play this week. Plus the Saints, they weren't amazing against the run last year, but historically they also have been very tough against opposing fantasy running backs. And then for the Saints, Alvin Kamara is someone who I view as like a pretty gross pick in redraft, but I'm also coming around to the fact that the competition is very limited. I think he's going to have a solid workload. He's kind of game script proof where he'll get involved on the ground, but even if they're trailing, he's just going to rack up a ton of receiving usage. So Kamara's a start for me, and then going to be sitting Jamal Williams. Shifting over to the Vikings Giants matchup here. For the Vikings, I have Aaron Jones as a start. I think it'll be interesting to see how much Aaron Jones is used. We know with the Packers, his workload was always kind of limited. LaFleur really likes a committee. It was him and A.J. Dillon. It'll be interesting to see how Kevin O'Connell handles this situation, but I think Aaron Jones is a fine like mid to back end RB2 play. Ty Chandler, I know he made some noise last year. I do think he's going to be firmly behind Aaron Jones. Could definitely have some usage, but on an offense with some question marks, especially the quarterback position, don't really want to start their running back 2, especially in week 1. And then for the Giants, I actually heavily debated Devin Singletary as a start. I think at this point, he is the clear favorite to lead this backfield. We saw the starters play in week 2 of the preseason, and Devin Singletary played 29 out of 33 snaps. He ran 15 routes on 19 dropbacks, and he saw 10 carries in the first half. So that is amazing usage. It is worth noting, though, that Tyrone Tracy was hurt for that game. Tracy could be ready to go here in week 1, and I'd say he'd be like the top candidate to kind of take away work from Devin Singletary. I think my main concern here is just the overall Giants offense, where even if he has decent usage, if this offense is just awful, it's going to be tough for Devin Singletary. So that's what's holding him back as a start. I bet when I go through and do my running back rankings, closer to the Thursday night game, he's probably going to be listed as a high-end RB3, but just missed the cut for me as someone that I'd feel pretty confident starting. And then in the next one, we're going to have the Raiders taking on the Chargers. And the Raiders are probably one of the backfields that I'm most interested in taking a look at the usage for this game, because there was hype early on in the offseason after Josh Jacobs left that Zamir White could really just be like a monster workhorse for this offense. And I think he's definitely going to be guaranteed like that early down work, the goal line usage. But I think it'll be interesting to see how much Madison and Lauby kind of work in as receiving backs, because if Zamir White is relegated to like early down grinder, unlikely a not very good offense, he could still be like a fine fringe RB2, but the upside is pretty limited. I will say that if Zamir White is that like early down grinder role, this is a fine matchup for that. The Raiders, probably not going to be a great overall team. The Chargers are 3.5-point favorites, but this is not like a game script where I think it's going to get out of hand and Zamir White gets phased out of the offense. The Chargers allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to the running back position last year, so I think Zamir White is a fine play as like a back-end RB2, and then sitting the current number 2 in Alexander Madison. Then we have the Chargers here, and this running back room feels pretty up in the air at this point. I'd say the top 2 options, at least for week 1, are likely going to be Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins. I slightly prefer Gus Edwards at this point. He had a solid year last year. J.K. Dobbins is coming off a torn Achilles, which can really just be a killer for, running backs. So I think it's definitely one of the more interesting running back rooms. I am going to go with Gus Edwards as a fringe option, J.K. Dobbins as a sit. Chargers, I do think they're going to want to run the ball. I think they're going to want a decent amount of rushing volume. So I want to see how that's going to be split up. But if I was playing one of these dudes, it definitely would be Gus Edwards. In the next matchup, we are going to have the Broncos taking on the Seahawks. And I think this Broncos running back room is another pretty interesting one. But the more, the offseason has kind of gone on here, the closer we're getting to week 1, the more and more excited I am getting about Javonte Williams. This is no longer like an extra gross 4-man mix with Samaje Perine getting released. You now have the main competition as Jaleel McLaughlin and Audric Estime. And the way I'm kind of viewing this backfield right now is I feel like Estime is more of like the clear Javonte early down handcuff. He might be mixing in, but I don't think he's going to be taking like significant usage away from Javonte Williams. And then I feel like Jaleel McLaughlin is more of like a fun, get the ball in his hands type of player, but not someone who's going to be taking a ton of volume. So I feel like Javonte should have an efficiency bounce back, right? Last year was his first year off the torn ACL. He's now a full season removed from that. We know people aren't like Breece Hall and can just come back instantly. So I think he could definitely have a solid workload, and I think he could definitely end up working his way into like solid RB2 territory. Week 1, there's still some uncertainty about the usage, so I'm going to list him as a fringe option, but I am cautiously optimistic about Javonte Williams' rest of season. And then for the Seahawks here, I think Kenneth Walker is a solid running back to play. The Seahawks are another offense, not just at the running back position, but just in general, I'm really excited to see with new offensive coordinator Grubb in there. They have some solid weapons, DK, JSN Lockett, a solid running back room, Noah Fant. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the split looks like between Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. And then also, are they approaching this as a super pass-heavy offense? Are they going to be running this offense through the running backs? Will definitely be something I'll be watching out for on Sunday. Pivoting over to the Cowboys Browns matchup here, this Cowboys running back room, it looks pretty gross. I don't think we have a ton of answers at this point, but if I had to pick one guy to play this week, it would be Rico Dowdle. They just signed Dalvin Cook. Personally, I have zero interest in Dalvin Cook. I remember last year I was super in on Breece Hall. The Jets signed Dalvin Cook, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, Dalvin Cook's going to be the starter. Like Breece Hall, you have to tank him in your rankings. Fortunately, I did not do that. I ended up with a lot of Breece Hall, but Dalvin Cook is very cooked at this point, right? He was a really good running back in his prime. He is no longer in his prime. We know Zeke has been washed for a couple of years now. So I do think we're going to have some split probably between Rico and Zeke. But if I had to make a claim on one of these dudes, it would be Rico Dowdle. He's one of my favorite later round picks, just because even though this is a very gross running back room, I don't think Rico Dowdle is some sort of stud. The Cowboys led the NFL in points per game last year. So one of these dudes is going to be fantasy relevant. Tony Pollard had the second most red zone touches. So I like Rico Dowdle, and I guess we'll just wait and see how this backfield kind of plays out. And then looking at the Browns here, Nick Chubb is going to be starting the year off on the PUP, which means that Jerome Ford should definitely be the favorite to lead this backfield. And you may be wondering why I have him here as a fringe option. If he's the clear-cut starter, he could definitely be considered as a top 24 option. This is just a really, really tough matchup. The Cowboys allowed the 6th fewest points per game to the running back position last year. I don't know if Jerome Ford is going to be an 80+% opportunity share guy. And I still think there are just some overall question marks with this Browns offense, especially in a tough matchup. So I'd say he's probably more of a higher end RB3, but definitely not someone who I'm stoked to throw into my starting lineup. And then the next one is going to be the Commanders taking on the Buccaneers. And I kind of like Brian Robinson this year, a little bit higher on him than consensus. I think he's definitely going to be a more fantasy relevant option than Austin Eckler, but this is also a very, very tough week 1 matchup. The Buccaneers run defense under Todd Bowles has been absolutely elite. They allowed the 5th fewest points per game to running backs last year. So I have him as a fringe option, solid RB3. Austin Eckler, just not really someone I'm interested in playing. And then for the Buccaneers, although I do have some concerns about Rachaad White maintaining his usage long-term, I think in week 1, Bucky Irving's a rookie. I feel like he's going to have really strong usage here against the Commanders, and I think he is a very, very nice start. On Sunday Night Football, we are going to have the Rams taking on the Lions. And for the Rams, I do think some of the recent news about Kyren Williams has not been great, right? The returning punts, that's not something I'm completely freaking out on. It's also the beat reporters talking about how Blake Corum has really kind of worked his way in with the starters, the ones. They think there's some risk of them just straight up trading off on drives. So I have some concerns with Kyren Williams. I drafted him in one league, not feeling great about that pick at this point, but I still think he's going to be a solid starter week 1. And even if this does turn into a 50-50 committee or 55-45, there's a real chance that both of these running backs could be fantasy relevant. So I have Corum as a sit, but I do think he's someone who could work his way into this backfield and definitely could be, someone who earns a solid role. And then for the Lions, Jahmyr Gibbs definitely going to be a start for me. And I think David Montgomery is also a solid play as a mid to back end RB2 option. We saw this Lions offense support 2 solid running backs last year. I guess they were kind of the poor man's version of the Dolphins, but this is going to be a good enough offense, good O-line. Dave Montgomery going to have some touchdown upside. Jahmyr Gibbs is obviously going to dominate more in the receiving work, but also, have some solid work on the ground. So I think Jahmyr Gibbs more of an RB1, David Montgomery an RB2 play. And then the final game of the week, Monday Night Football, we have the New York Jets taking on the San Francisco 49ers. And this one might be the biggest no-brainer matchup of them all. Breece Hall, taking on Christian McCaffrey. These are my top 2 running backs this year for fantasy. Obviously, you are firing up Breece Hall, Braylon Allen, like fine handcuff. Then Christian McCaffrey, you are firing him up. And then Jordan Mason, a solid handcuff, but very easy matchup there. So that is going to wrap it up for all 16 week 1 matchups. If you guys have any fantasy questions, you can drop them down below. I'll have my wide receiver start sit video out tomorrow. Quarterback and tight ends should be the day after. I'll have my rankings. I'll have a waiver wire video. So if you did enjoy, you stuck around all the way until the end, thank you. I appreciate it. Do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.